The strangest thing about being taken for granted is that nobody ever tells you when it starts. I learned that lesson on a warm Saturday afternoon standing in my son's backyard with a paper plate in my hand and a smile on my face. My name is Evelyn Parker. I was 70 years old, recently retired, and finally beginning to enjoy the life I had spent decades working toward. For the first time in years, my calendar belonged to me. I had joined a book club. I volunteered twice a month at the local library. I was planning a fall trip through New England to see the leaves change color. Life felt peaceful. That afternoon, my son Jason invited me to a family barbecue. It seemed like an ordinary gathering. The grill was going. Children were running through the yard. Music played softly from speakers near the patio. My 5 grandchildren chased one another across the grass while neighbors and relatives chatted beneath large patio umbrellas. I brought a homemade peach cobbler and a bowl of potato salad. Nothing fancy. Just enough to contribute. Brittany greeted me with a quick hug before rushing off to organize something. That was normal. Brittany was always organizing something. I found a seat near the patio and spent the next hour talking with relatives, laughing with the children, and enjoying the sunshine. Everything felt comfortable, familiar. Then Brittany stood up and tapped her glass with a spoon. Conversation slowly faded. People turned toward her. She smiled broadly and wrapped an arm around Jason's shoulder. "Before everyone leaves, we have a little announcement," she said. A few people clapped automatically. I assumed they were planning a family vacation, or maybe celebrating one of the children's accomplishments. Brittany looked genuinely excited. "As everyone knows, Mom is retired now." Several heads turned toward me. I smiled politely. "And because she finally has so much free time," Brittany continued, "we worked out a wonderful solution for the weekends." I frowned slightly. "Worked out what solution?" Jason smiled beside her. Brittany laughed and gestured toward the children playing in the yard. "From now on, Mom will be babysitting all 5 kids every weekend." The backyard exploded with applause. Some people cheered. Others nodded approvingly. Someone even said, "That is perfect." I sat perfectly still. At first, I honestly thought I had misunderstood. I glanced around the yard waiting for someone to correct her. Nobody did. Brittany continued speaking as though she were announcing something generous. "This helps everyone. The kids adore Grandma. Jason and I can finally have time for ourselves. And Mom gets quality family time." More smiles. More approval. My fingers tightened slightly around the paper plate. Nobody asked if I wanted quality family time every weekend. Nobody asked whether I already had plans. Nobody asked anything at all. I looked toward Jason. Surely my son would realize how strange this was. Instead, he smiled and raised his drink toward me. "Thanks again, Mom." "Thanks again." The word struck me harder than the announcement itself. Again. As though the decision had already been made. As though my agreement was merely a formality. Around me, conversations resumed. People began discussing weekend schedules and future plans involving my time. I sat quietly and listened. The children laughed in the distance. The smell of barbecue drifted through the air. Everything looked normal. Yet something felt deeply wrong. Because in that moment, I realized I was the only person in the backyard who had not known about the announcement. For the rest of the afternoon, I smiled whenever someone looked my way. Years of motherhood had taught me how to remain pleasant, even when I felt uncomfortable. Inside, however, questions kept piling up. Why had nobody discussed this with me beforehand? Why did everyone seem so certain I would agree? Most importantly, how long had this plan existed without my knowledge? The gathering slowly returned to normal. Children ran through sprinklers. Adults refilled their drinks and talked about work, vacations, and school schedules. Yet I noticed something strange. Every time the topic of weekends came up, people spoke as though my availability was already guaranteed. One relative mentioned a concert Jason and Brittany wanted to attend in June. Another talked about a weekend getaway they had been planning. Someone else joked that grandparents were the greatest retirement benefit a family could have. Everyone laughed. I forced a smile. The joke did not feel funny anymore. Later, while carrying empty plates into the kitchen, I overheard part of a conversation between Brittany and one of her friends. They were standing only a few feet away. Neither realized I could hear them. "This solves everything," the friend said. Brittany laughed. "I know. Childcare was becoming ridiculous. You are lucky. Trust me, I have been working on this for months. Months. The word stopped me in my tracks. I remained where I was, hidden partially by the pantry wall. Jason was worried she might hesitate, Brittany continued. But once everyone heard it together, it would be awkward for her to say no. Her friend laughed softly. That is actually pretty smart. Brittany sounded proud of herself. Besides, what else is she doing with her weekends? I quietly placed the plates on the counter and stepped outside before they noticed me. The warm afternoon suddenly felt different. Not because Brittany wanted help with the children. Grandparents helping occasionally is normal. What bothered me was the assumption that my retirement belonged to someone else. Nobody had asked. Nobody had considered that I might have plans of my own. They had simply decided. A few minutes later, Jason found me sitting alone near the garden. "Everything okay, Mom?" he asked. I studied his face. He genuinely seemed confused. That hurt more than anger would have. "How long have you known about this?" I asked calmly. He frowned. "About what?" "The weekend childcare plan." His expression shifted. Not surprise. Recognition. "A while, I guess." I nodded slowly. "And you never thought to ask me?" He looked uncomfortable. "We just assumed you would be happy to spend more time with the kids." There it was again. Assumed. Everyone seemed to love that word. Assumed I would agree. Assumed I was available. Assumed my retirement existed for their convenience. That is a big commitment, Jason. It is only weekends. Only weekends. Two words that sounded small until I considered what they really meant. Every Saturday. Every Sunday. Month after month. Year after year. My book club. My volunteer work. My travel plans. My freedom. All quietly replaced by a schedule someone else created. Before I could respond, one of the grandchildren called for him from across the yard. Jason smiled and walked away. The conversation ended as quickly as it began. Yet his reaction told me everything. This was not Brittany's plan alone. Everyone already knew. Everyone had already agreed. Everyone except me. As the sun began to set and families started gathering their things, I loaded my empty serving dishes into the trunk of my car. Brittany waved cheerfully from the driveway. "I will send you the weekend schedule tomorrow," she called. Schedule. Not request. Not question. Schedule. I smiled politely and waved back. Then I drove home wondering what else had already been decided for me without my knowledge. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating on the kitchen counter. Sunlight streamed through the window above the sink as I poured myself a cup of coffee and glanced at the screen. The message was from Brittany. Attached was a document titled Weekend Childcare Rotation. For a moment I simply stared at it. Then I opened it. My coffee grew cold as I scrolled through page after page. Every weekend for the next 4 months had already been assigned. Saturdays from 8 in the morning until 8 at night. Sundays from 9 until 6. There were notes about meals, nap schedules, sports practices, allergies, pickup times, and emergency contacts. Brittany had even color-coded the calendar. My name appeared on every single weekend. Not some weekends. Not most weekends. Every weekend. I sat down slowly and continued reading. There were instructions for birthday parties. Instructions for soccer tournaments. Instructions for school projects. One section listed approved snacks. Another included screen time limits. By the end, the document looked less like a family arrangement and more like an employee handbook. I set my phone on the table and stared out the window. Across the street, my neighbor was loading suitcases into her car. She and her husband were leaving for a weekend trip. Last month, I had considered joining them. We had talked about visiting several historic towns and staying at a small bed and breakfast. Looking at the schedule on my phone, I realized every weekend of that trip had already been claimed by someone else. Not because I agreed to it, because someone assumed I would. Around noon, I left the house to attend my monthly book club meeting. The group met at a small independent bookstore downtown. Normally, those afternoons filled me with energy. This time I found myself distracted. As the discussion continued around me, my thoughts kept returning to the schedule. The women in my group talked about retirement plans, hobbies, travel, volunteer work, and family. Listening to them, I realized something important. Every person there had chosen how to spend their retirement years. Some traveled. Some gardened. Some cared for grandchildren occasionally. But the choice belonged to them. Choice. That was the part missing from my situation. Later that evening, I returned home and found another message waiting. This one included an updated calendar invitation. Brittany had added me to a shared family schedule. Again, every weekend was marked. Again, nobody asked. As I reviewed the calendar, another detail caught my attention. Several weekends included notes about Jason and Brittany's plans. Concert tickets, wine tours, couples retreats, day trips, date nights. The more I read, the clearer everything became. They had not built their schedule around my availability. They had built their freedom around my assumed availability. My phone rang just before dinner. It was Emma, my oldest granddaughter. At 17, she was thoughtful in ways that often surprised me. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." There was hesitation in her voice. "Are you really going to watch everyone every weekend?" I paused. "Why do you ask?" She sighed. "Because Mom has been talking about it for months." Months again. The same word I had heard at the barbecue. What exactly has she been saying? I asked gently. Emma grew quiet for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded uncomfortable. "She keeps saying everything is finally solved now." I looked at the calendar still glowing on my screen. Every weekend. Every month. My future arranged by someone else. And for the first time, I began wondering how many people already believed the decision had been made forever. After my conversation with Emma, I could not stop thinking about one question. If Brittany had been planning this for months, what else had already been decided without me knowing? The next few days gave me more answers than I expected. On Tuesday morning, I opened my email and found a message from Brittany titled Weekend Logistics. Attached were several documents. One outlined emergency procedures. Another listed the children's extracurricular schedules. There was even a page explaining household rules for screen time, snacks, bedtime routines, and transportation. I stared at the attachments in disbelief. The level of detail was remarkable. More remarkable was the fact that nobody had ever asked whether I wanted any of it. The documents read as though I had already accepted the position. As though my only responsibility now was learning the requirements. Later that afternoon, I met my friend Linda for lunch. We had known each other for nearly 20 years. Retirement had given us both more freedom, and we often spent afternoons exploring local restaurants or visiting museums. As we sat near a window overlooking Main Street, she asked about my upcoming fall trip through New England. I hesitated before answering. "I am not sure that trip is happening anymore." Linda frowned. "Why not?" I explained the situation, the announcement, the schedule, the assumptions, the color-coded calendar. The more I spoke, the more surprised she looked. When I finished, she set down her coffee cup and stared at me. "Evelyn, did anyone actually ask you?" "No." "Then why are they acting like this is settled?" It was such a simple question. Yet I realized I had been asking myself the same thing for days. After lunch, I drove home and began reviewing some notes I kept in a planner. Retirement had been something I prepared for carefully. Years before leaving my job, I created a list of experiences I wanted to enjoy while I was healthy enough to enjoy them. Volunteer work, travel, community events, reading programs at the library, gardening classes, local history tours. The list was not extravagant. It was simply mine. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed something painful. Several activities already conflicted with the childcare schedule Brittany had sent. Not because I chose the conflict, because someone else scheduled over my life without consulting me. That evening, another message arrived from Brittany. She had updated the shared calendar again. One weekend now included a note about a couple's retreat she and Jason planned to attend. Another mentioned a concert several hours away. A third referenced a wine country getaway with friends. Reading the calendar felt strangely revealing. Every addition reinforced the same truth. They were not organizing my retirement. They were organizing theirs. My weekends had become the foundation supporting their plans. On Thursday evening, I attended a volunteer orientation at the library. As I listened to upcoming community projects, I felt something I had not felt all week. Excitement. Genuine excitement. The coordinator spoke about literacy programs, reading groups, and outreach events. I found myself smiling again. Then my phone buzzed. A new calendar notification appeared. Weekend childcare confirmed. The contrast could not have been clearer. One path represented the life I had spent years building. The other represented a life someone else had built for me. When I returned home that night, I sat quietly in my living room and looked at the framed photograph of my late husband Robert. He used to tell me that retirement was not about stopping work. It was about finally having the freedom to choose where your time goes. As I sat there, those words stayed with me, because for the first time I understood what bothered me most. It was not the children. I loved my grandchildren. It was not helping occasionally. Families help one another. What bothered me was that everyone seemed to believe my choices no longer mattered. And once I recognized that, I knew something would eventually have to change. The conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I had spent the morning organizing books for the library reading program, and returned home tired but satisfied. The house felt peaceful. Rain tapped softly against the windows while a pot of soup simmered on the stove. Around 3 o'clock my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, I found Emma standing on the porch holding her backpack. She looked nervous. More nervous than I had ever seen her. "Hi, Grandma," she said quietly. "Do you have a minute?" I invited her inside and made us both hot chocolate. We sat at the kitchen table while the rain continued outside. For a few minutes we talked about school, college applications, and her upcoming graduation year. Yet it was obvious something else was on her mind. She kept wrapping her hands around the mug without taking a sip. Finally, she looked down at the table. "Grandma, I need to tell you something." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I waited patiently. Emma had always been thoughtful. If she came here to talk, it meant the conversation mattered. "I heard Mom talking to one of her friends last week." My stomach tightened slightly. "About what?" Emma hesitated. "About you." Neither of us spoke for a moment. Rain continued tapping against the glass. "What did she say?" I asked gently. Emma looked uncomfortable. "She was talking about the weekends." I remained silent. "Her friend asked if you agreed to watch the kids." Emma swallowed hard. Mom laughed. A strange feeling settled in my chest. Not surprise. Recognition. And then, Emma looked directly at me. "She said she did not need to ask because you would never say no." The words hung in the air between us. I stared at the steam rising from my mug. Somewhere deep down I had suspected something like this. Hearing it aloud felt different. More real. More painful. Emma continued carefully. "Then her friend asked what she would do if you changed your mind." I looked up. "What did your mother say?" Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "She said that would never happen because you love the children too much." I nodded slowly. The manipulation was subtle, almost invisible. Brittany was not counting on my availability. She was counting on my guilt. Emma looked relieved that I was not angry. Then she said something that hurt even more. "There was one other thing." I waited. "Mom called you the permanent babysitter." For a moment I simply sat there. Permanent babysitter. Not grandmother. Not family. Not someone with her own life. Just a role. A function. A solution to a problem. Emma quickly added. I do not think she meant it to sound bad. I managed a small smile. Maybe not. But intent and impact are not always the same thing. I thought about the travel plans sitting in my desk drawer. The volunteer programs. The lunches with friends. The experiences I had postponed for decades while raising a family and building a career. Somehow all of those things had become less important than everyone else's convenience. Emma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I do not think it is fair. The simple honesty in her voice nearly brought tears to my eyes. Not because she solved the problem. Because she saw it. Sometimes being seen matters more than being helped. We talked for another hour before she left. After closing the front door behind her, I stood quietly in the hallway. The house felt different somehow. Clearer. For weeks I had been trying to understand why the situation bothered me so much. Emma had finally given me the answer. It was never about childcare. It was about being reduced to a role that someone else created. And once I understood that, I began looking back at everything I had already given my family through very different eyes. That evening after Emma left, I pulled an old storage box from the hall closet and carried it into the living room. The box contained years of photographs, planners, receipts, and handwritten notes. I was not looking for evidence. At least not at first. I was looking for perspective. Somewhere along the way, the situation had stopped feeling like a simple misunderstanding and started feeling like a pattern. I wanted to know if that feeling was justified. I began with photo albums. There was Jason's first house. I remembered spending 2 weekends helping paint walls and assemble furniture. Then came pictures from family vacations. Looking through them, I realized something I had never noticed before. In almost every photo I was present. Yet in many of those same memories I had also been working. Watching children. Preparing meals. Handling logistics. Solving problems so everyone else could relax. Next came the planners. Year after year I found notes written in my own handwriting. Pick up Emma from school. Watch the twins while Brittany attends conference. Take children to soccer tournament. Overnight childcare. Emergency pickup. Weekend coverage. The entries stretched across years. Hundreds of small moments. Individually, none seemed significant. Together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. By midnight, several stacks covered my coffee table. One pile represented canceled plans. Another represented family obligations. A third contained activities I postponed because someone needed help. The numbers surprised me most. Not financial numbers. Time. I began estimating hours. A weekend here. 3 days there. A full week during one summer vacation. School breaks. Holidays. Unexpected emergencies. By the time I finished, the total exceeded thousands of hours. Thousands. I sat back and stared at the figure. No wonder everyone assumed I would always be available. I had trained them to believe it. Not intentionally, but consistently. Every time I rearranged my life to make theirs easier, the expectation grew stronger. The realization was uncomfortable because it forced me to acknowledge my own role in the pattern. Brittany did not create it alone. Jason did not create it alone. I helped build it every time I said yes when I wanted to say maybe. Every time I said maybe when I wanted to say no. The next morning, I attended a volunteer meeting at the library. During a break, the coordinator announced a special literacy project that would run throughout the fall. Volunteers would travel to different communities and help organize reading events for children. As she described the program, I felt genuinely excited. Then I remembered the childcare calendar. Every weekend was already occupied. Not by my choice. By someone else's assumption. Suddenly the contrast became impossible to ignore. One future involved growth, friendships, travel, and purpose. The other involved following a schedule that had been assigned to me without permission. Later that afternoon, another message arrived from Brittany. She was updating pickup instructions for one of the younger children. There was no greeting, no question, no discussion, just instructions. I read the message twice. Then I set my phone down. For the first time, instead of feeling guilty, I felt calm. Calm because I finally understood what was happening. This was never about helping family. Helping family is a choice made from love. This was about ownership of time. Somewhere along the way, people had begun acting as though my retirement belonged to them. As though my weekends were community property. As though my plans mattered only after everyone else's needs were satisfied. Looking around my quiet living room, I realized something simple but important. I had spent decades raising children, building a career, caring for relatives, and supporting the people I loved. I did not regret any of it. But retirement was supposed to be the season when I finally chose how to spend my days. And the more I reflected on everything I had already given, the more certain I became that I was not willing to give away the rest without being asked. The moment arrived on a Thursday evening. There was nothing dramatic about it. No family gathering. No public announcement. No argument. In fact, I was standing in my kitchen watering a small herb garden near the window when my phone vibrated. A new message from Brittany appeared on the screen. She had updated the weekend schedule again. One of the younger children had been invited to a birthday party. Another needed transportation to a soccer tournament. Brittany included pickup times, meal instructions, and a reminder about a school project due on Monday. At the bottom of the message was a simple sentence. "Thank you for handling everything this weekend." I read the message twice, then a third time. What struck me was not the request. There was no request. That was the problem. Every instruction assumed agreement. Every plan assumed availability. Every expectation assumed ownership of my time. I looked around my kitchen. On the counter sat a brochure from the New England trip I had been planning. Beside it was a flyer for the library literacy program. Across the room rested a gardening book I had been eager to finish. Small things. Ordinary things. Pieces of a life I had spent years waiting to enjoy. Slowly, I opened the message and began typing a response. For several seconds I stared at the screen. A familiar feeling tried to creep in. Guilt. The same guilt that had followed me for years whenever I considered putting myself first. Then I thought about Emma. I thought about the calendar. I thought about being called the permanent babysitter. Most of all, I thought about choice. The message I finally sent contained only one word. No. I placed the phone on the counter and returned to watering the herbs. My heart was beating faster than usual, but I felt strangely calm. 10 minutes later, the phone rang. Brittany. I let it go to voicemail. A second call followed. Then a third. Finally, a text appeared. I think there has been a misunderstanding. I did not respond. A few minutes later, Jason called. I answered. Mom, Brittany said you are not available this weekend. His voice sounded confused. That is correct. Silence followed. What do you mean? I almost laughed. Not because the question was funny, because it revealed everything. The possibility that I might simply not be available had never occurred to them. I have plans, I said. Another pause. What plans? The question landed harder than he intended. What plans? As though my plans required approval. As though they only mattered if someone else considered them important enough. Personal plans, I replied calmly. Jason exhaled slowly. Mom, we already arranged everything. I know. The kids are expecting it. I understand. Brittany has commitments. I looked out the window toward the fading evening light. So do I. The conversation stalled. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, my son had no response. Eventually, he said he would call later and ended the conversation. I set the phone down and waited. More messages arrived throughout the evening. Some sounded confused. Others sounded frustrated. None asked the question that should have been asked from the beginning. What would you like to do? By bedtime, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Nothing in my life had changed yet. The weekend had not arrived. The schedules still existed. The expectations remained. Yet something important was different. A boundary had finally appeared where none existed before. And all it took was one word that I should have used much sooner. Saturday morning arrived bright and clear. I woke before sunrise not because I was worried but because I was excited. Months earlier, before any childcare schedules existed, I had booked a weekend trip with several friends from my book club. We planned to visit a historic coastal town, explore local shops, and attend a community literary festival. The reservation confirmations had been sitting in my desk for weeks. For the first time since retiring, I felt completely certain that I was doing exactly what I wanted to do. By 7 o'clock, my suitcase was packed and sitting beside the front door. I was pouring coffee into a travel mug when my phone began vibrating. Jason. I let it ring. A minute later, Brittany called. Then another call. Then a message. We are on our way. I stared at the screen for a moment. On our way. Not can we talk. Not are you available. Just another assumption. I placed the phone in my purse and continued getting ready. 20 minutes later, a vehicle pulled into my driveway. Through the front window, I saw Jason and Brittany climbing out. Behind them, the children remained in the vehicle. Suitcases were visible through the rear windows. For a moment, I simply stood there. Not angry. Not surprised. Just disappointed. Even after everything, they still believed I would eventually give in. The doorbell rang. Then again. Finally, I opened the door. Brittany smiled tightly. We need to make this quick. We are running late. I glanced toward the vehicle. For what? Our weekend. Her tone suggested the answer should have been obvious. Jason shifted awkwardly beside her. Brittany continued. The kids are packed and ready. I nodded. I can see that. She waited. So did Jason. Neither seemed to realize anything was wrong. I told you earlier this week that I was unavailable. Brittany laughed nervously. We thought you were upset and needed some time. The statement revealed everything. They had interpreted my answer not as a decision, but as an emotional obstacle to overcome. No, I said calmly. I meant exactly what I said. Silence followed. Jason finally spoke. Mom, we already paid for reservations. And I already made commitments. Brittany crossed her arms. You are seriously choosing a trip over your grandchildren? There it was. The guilt Emma predicted. The same strategy wrapped in different words. I looked past them toward the children waiting in the vehicle. I loved those children deeply. That had never been the issue. I am choosing my own schedule, I replied. Brittany opened her mouth, then closed it. For perhaps the first time, she realized the conversation was not moving in the direction she expected. Behind her, one of the children pressed a face against the window, curious about the delay. Jason rubbed his forehead. What are we supposed to do now? I thought about the question carefully. For years I would have solved the problem, rearranged my plans, sacrificed my weekend, made everything easy. This time I did something different. I do not know, I said honestly. That is something the two of you need to figure out. Neither of them responded. Eventually I wished them a safe day, closed the door, picked up my suitcase and walked out through the garage toward my car. As I backed down the driveway, I caught a glimpse of Jason standing silently beside the vehicle. Brittany looked stunned. Not furious. Not heartbroken. Simply stunned that the plan had failed. Several hours later, I sat beside the ocean with friends, listening to waves roll onto the shore. My phone contained dozens of missed calls and messages. I did not read them. For the first time in a very long while, somebody else's emergency was not automatically my responsibility. And the feeling was far more peaceful than I ever imagined. When I returned home on Sunday evening, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed physically. The furniture sat where it always had. The photographs still lined the hallway. The roses outside the kitchen window continued blooming exactly as before. Yet something inside me had shifted. For the first time in years, I had chosen myself without apologizing for it. My phone remained unusually quiet during the drive home. That alone told me something. The crisis everyone predicted had apparently been solved. The children survived the weekend. The world continued turning. Life moved forward. On Monday afternoon, Jason called and asked if he could stop by. His voice sounded tired. Not angry, just tired. When he arrived, he sat across from me at the kitchen table where so many family conversations had taken place over the years. For a few minutes neither of us spoke. Then he looked down at his hands. I owe you an apology. I remained silent and let him continue. I think I stopped seeing how much you were doing. The honesty surprised me. Not just recently, he said. For years. I thought about the calendars, the assumptions, the conversations I overheard, the plans made without me. What changed? I asked gently. Jason sighed. This weekend. He gave a small laugh. We spent 2 days trying to find solutions that we usually expected you to provide. There was no bitterness in his voice, only realization. And I asked, and I finally understood how much of our life was built around the assumption that you would always say yes. The room grew quiet. After a moment he continued. That was not fair. Hearing those words lifted a weight I had not realized I was carrying. Not because I needed validation. Because accountability matters. Brittany did not come with him that day. I was not surprised. Some lessons take longer than others. Before leaving, Jason handed me a small envelope. Inside was a printed copy of the shared family calendar. Every weekend assignment attached to my name had been removed. In their place was a simple note. Available only when she chooses. I stared at those words for several seconds. Then I smiled. Not because they gave me permission. Because they acknowledged something that should have been obvious all along. My time belonged to me. Over the following months, life settled into a healthier rhythm. Sometimes I watched the grandchildren. Sometimes I did not. The difference was simple. People asked. I traveled through New England and watched the leaves turn brilliant shades of red and gold. I volunteered at literacy events throughout the fall. I attended book club meetings without checking whether someone else needed me first. Slowly, relationships improved. Even Brittany became more respectful. Not overnight, but gradually. Boundaries have a way of teaching lessons that arguments never can. One evening near the end of the year, Emma sat beside me during a family dinner and smiled. "You seem happier lately, Grandma." I looked around the table. The children were laughing. Jason was telling a story. Brittany was helping serve dessert. For the first time in a long while, nobody was assigning me responsibilities I had not agreed to. Nobody was making decisions on my behalf. Nobody was treating my life like a public resource. "I am happier," I admitted. Emma squeezed my hand. "Good." As I drove home later that night, I thought about everything that had happened. The announcements, the schedules, the assumptions, the single word that changed everything. Looking back, I realized the most important lesson had nothing to do with childcare. It was this: love and availability are not the same thing. Being a grandmother does not mean surrendering ownership of your life. Helping family is meaningful when it comes from choice. The moment it becomes an obligation imposed by someone else, something important is lost. And after spending decades caring for everyone around me, I finally understood that protecting my own time was not selfish. It was simply respecting the life I had worked so hard to build.